Hello and welcome back to UML Operator. We're going to pick up in this episode where we left off in part 1 of 3 on baseline practices in UML modeling. So in our last episode, we touched on planning your baseline strategy, using packages effectively, and creating meaningful names that can carry across all your delivery and over time. Adding descriptions to the elements, the objects, these are packages, diagrams, and so on, is extremely powerful in being able to help you achieve your objectives and then carry forth those objectives as you continue to get better and better. In this episode, we're going to talk about change management, documenting changes and the use of notes. This helps, again, what I was just talking about in extending what you're trying to deliver. We're going to talk about comparing before restoring. Don't make the mistake of stepping on other modelers' work or even stepping on your own work. Do a compare. This is what baseline gives us. This is what version control gives us and is extremely valuable. The use of version control systems where possible is something to bring up, and I'll try to touch on it. But with Sparx, you really don't need to use version control systems. I use them extensively in the early part of this century, and I've kind of moved away from it, except when I'm dealing with code development projects. So we'll take the code development packages and follow whatever the company or the shop's software configuration management, SCM practices are, and the VCS, the version control system that they're using. We're going to talk about coordinating with team-based modeling. It's very important that everyone's on the same page, the same practices when going forward. It doesn't mean they have to adhere to them. It just means that, well, if you come up with a better idea of something, let's run it through governance, let's run it through change management before we start implementing it across the team. So the team coordination is critical. We're going to talk about automating where possible. This basically helps in delivering your projects. I want to say anything, because a project, you might not call it a project. It might be a session, a sprint, a session dealing with a particular defect, any type of delivery that you're trying to achieve. So when you're automating, you're going to be able to just repeat your defined practices and processes much faster in your delivery. We're most certainly going to talk about backing up your repository. More importantly, backing up your baselines and when and where to do that. And then we're going to conclude before we get into part 3, and that's going to be the demonstration of everything we're talking about. We're going to conclude with something called educate stakeholders. You know, you may have a communication plan, a kickoff meeting, you're getting everyone on your documentation and so on, but those are going really fast. Not everyone's paying attention, and we may have to educate our stakeholders along the way. So let's get started. Next, I want to talk about documenting changes in your model. So anytime you need to make changes, it's a good idea to document. And I'm just going to show you a very simple example. This particular model was requested by the stakeholders in order to expose extensibility, to expose extended meaning and intelligence. And in this case, we're using tag values, and we need to expose those. So change requests were put in, and it's very easy when you're working on a particular model, even if it's blank or you've already started working on it, saying, hey, I've added this model, I'm making this a change to my solution analysis. And while you're in the toolbox for a particular diagram type, you can hit the hamburger up here, go to extended, and then go to maintenance toolbox. And in here, you've got change, you can log issues, you can start test cases to test the validity of the diagram, and much more, right? So in this case, we're bringing in change elements. And we have created, if I go here to settings, auto names and numbers, and you've learned this in this channel, I'm going to go to the change type, and you can automatically uniquely number elements using this feature that you learned about in the channel. And we want to apply on creation. So when we're bringing in a change, like we're working on this model, we're collaborating, we're going through specific views, whether it's specification, relationship, Gantt views, and so on, and a change is needed. You just simply drag in a change, automatically numbers, increments to the number, and then you can start documenting the change with the team or by yourself on what you want or need to accomplish. So that led to the change in the creation of this model, and other changes were created as we were working through the delivery. Now, every project when you're starting, whether it's created or triggered by the project manager, let's go into project management namespaces, and let's look at particular discussion items. Matter of fact, I'm going to go to discussions, and in discussions, we have something called change management. And in change management, it may start out a very simple namespace and diagram, but as changes are added, we can grab this change. Maybe we've written it out together. We're going to hit Alt-G to find the CR within this namespace, and we're going to move it to the change management namespace. So now it's in the change management namespace and package, and in the change management diagram, this change can further be added as a link. And so you can see there's no namespace. It is in the parent folder, and you can expand on the change here as you're going forward. So when we're looking at this from a specification view, let's go ahead and save. You're able to say, hey, CR1, we needed to add a tag value. CR2, we need to add that tag, that scaled factors tag, to elements as part of, and this gets into practices for your naming convention, your scripts, and your notes and your comments. You want to reference what it's applicable to. In this case, we just do it as the first line in the note section and then explain the change. Same thing goes with any other change that's added. We just created this one. There's nothing in here, but we can work further on this proposed. So in this case, this was done and implemented. So the status changed to implemented. We finished the diagram that necessary and added scaled factors. It was approved and it was implemented. And the same thing goes through any other change management system. And in this, again, going back to change management, we go out. We're using navigation cells for a particular model that allows us to say that this diagram is realizing these CRs here. So lots of ways to approach this. This just happens to be the practice that was established here going forward. Next, I want to talk about compare a baseline in baselining before restoring. I know that some modelers will have an authorized modeler come in and make changes. And in this particular case, a modeler came in and put in some change requests on this diagram. So let's go to building blocks where this namespace for this diagram is. Control-Alt-B. We did an export, thought we were done. Thought we were done here. We did an export because someone wanted to exchange, import it in. So he said, all right, let's do an export and let's make a compare. Then someone came in and added CRs. So we're going to show differences. This is compare. You can compare it to a file, but we'll talk about backing up baselines and backing up the repository in a moment, but we're going to do a compare. So when we come in here, we're doing compare. We've got our realization, our new realization, which is still showing up here. That's fine. But if we go down here into building blocks diagram, we see that 3 CRs were added. They're new. You can see by green. And a modeler might go, wait a minute, I don't want these in this model. And what they will do is they will, let's close this. You can certainly launch it from the toolbar here. but I'm going to close this, come out of it. There may be a discussion that started on this with whoever authored the CRs, Control Alt B, and they'll go, I want to fall back or restore back to my export. And so what they'll do is restore to baseline. And there's differences. These CRs were added. And if I do that, it's going to remove these CRs from this diagram. Now, you may get an approval going, oh, that's fine. We've got a change management namespace. Those CRs are there and it's not going to interrupt them. So when you're doing a compare before restoring, if you're even going to do a restore, you make sure that the elements that were added are in an external namespace. And they are in this case because namespace is turned on. We can see these are in the change management namespace. We can close this. We can go to this one. We can hit Alt G. Takes us right to the namespace where they are. Here they are. And you feel comfortable doing a restore, but always compare before you do a restore. While I believe that all of the practices we've talked about so far are best practices and are critical, one of the ones that's probably most critical is the use of version control management. Whether you're talking about VCS, version control systems, or you're just talking about version control management, you may be using a network file source, you may be using a reusable asset service, RAS, and other means we've talked about in the channel. It's very important to have version control management. So let's go back into this. Let's right click, make sure that we're on the browser namespace, and we are right here. So we're on our package, Control Alt and B, bring up the baseline dialog box. We've done our compare. We saw a difference. We talked to the author of the CRs, and we're going to create a new baseline, 0.07, and you can put whatever you want in here. I'm just going to leave the default baseline date and time stamp in here and hit OK. Right, and that is done. Now what we're going to do is export. We're going to select export file. We're going to go to the space, the file, the network share that we want to export the file to. And we have a naming convention. I've already done it once, so I wanted to show it to speed up the video. We start with baseline, the name, underscore, the version, 07. This is meaningful. It's stating that, well, this is a baseline XML file, version 07 for the folder building blocks on this date, 09/22/25. And so then we can export this. Do you want to replace it? Yes. And now I have an export successfully completed of this baseline for versioning. And then if that's a network file share you have connected to your version control system, you can do those versioning practices if you need to version that file within your VCS. Next, I want to talk about automation, and this helps you with your naming conventions and the direction of the practices that you want to follow. So in this particular case, we're in a solution analysis. We add some CRs and we want to do analysis on a particular CR. So we have a convention and practice for doing that. And we've created a script to automate called add capability packages. And so what we're going to do is we're going to select this. It launches a dialog box to explain what they're getting ready to do. It then presents them with the dialog box for them to start the naming convention. In this case, we're going to go I'm going to go 001. And then you can put some more information in here. It'll be added to the package. So we might go CR analysis or something like that. And then we're going to hit enter. And it's going through automatically and creating the packages and naming conventions that we want to follow. Let's just bring in the packages. So it has components, it has development and non-development. So you can name these things any way you want. So, and you don't have to bring the packages. I'm just trying to prove a point here, is that you can create automation that goes through and even names the packages following a convention. But in this case, the topic is explained here, and I can't drag that on itself, but it basically is providing you with the naming convention, telling everyone what to do, how to name, and even within the packages themselves, if we go to notes and description, you can see that it's giving direction, right? And they just come in, read the convention for description they need to follow. Same thing for the diagram, the same thing for each namespace or subtopic or subpackage for a particular discussion area. So automation, and I just say automate where possible. I think if you're doing a lot of repeatable work within your project, automation is extremely powerful from a repeatable and defined perspective. Next, I want to talk about backing up your repository regularly. I know we're talking about practices relevant to baseline, but even baselines are in your Sparx SQL environment. So there's three stakeholders that I want to talk about. Number one is the model administrator. They're going to be working with your database administrator, and they're going to back up the entire model. And the model in this particular case is all the way, everything under this root node. There's two root nodes in here, but we're focused on this root node. They're going to back up this entire SQL instance, which contains both root nodes and the entire project that is being worked. So the model admin is going to focus on that. Now, since we're talking about the project manager and we're focused on baselining, we can look at various documents. There's going to be a lot going on in project management. There's going to be the project management itself, the baselines they're maintaining, the requirements engineer, other stakeholders, of course. There might be some baselines that they're looking for across discussions, change management, and other things. And then there's the solution architect, and then there's the application architects, design architects, and then there's development and deployment, which is going back to the application architects. And then there's test management. A lot of baselining going on there. But we've been using the solution architect as our case example, but the project manager can actually come in. We built a custom SQL script for them to look across the entire project. And let's just go 7 days back, a week, because they're going to be doing this over a week period of time. So either close of day on Friday or over the weekend, don't want to work on the weekend, then close the day, end of day Friday. They're going to run through and they're going to look at the baselines and what version of baselines are being run. And these are in the SQL database. So working with the model admin or the DBA, you can back up the database. And that's one way to have a backup of your baselines. Another way I've already showed you, and that's just simply going out to a particular package. And I certainly wouldn't do it this way because we're in a SQL environment. I would be doing it a bulk of the entire SQL project, but you can export the files like I showed you to an external source or a version control repository and save your baselines at particular versions. You can see how cumbersome this would be, right? So that is the project manager view. Let's talk about the model stakeholders next. Now, modelers as stakeholders in a project, they're going to follow the project practices, but they may come up with their own practices. So as they're doing baselines, they may be exporting the baseline files to a file share or even their own local to have a backup of their baseline. The reason for backing up a baseline would be, hey, I'm going on vacation, or it's a working weekend for everyone else but me. And when I return on Monday, I want to make sure that no one's changed anything. And I've come back and had my baseline accidentally, they said, deleted. See, delete selection. And I'm not worried about it because I have a backup of the baseline and I can simply import and bring that baseline back into my database. So the modelers are going to have their own processes for backing up their information, whether they're backing up timelines to look at particular dates and times of work they're doing. So they're working something over a period of time. Someone comes in and starts adding CRs, and they can come in here and save these snapshots to their, let me get out of this, close this view, save this. And this is Sparx 17, by the way. You could have the notion of timelines. They can do that. All right. Since we're focused on baselines, the reason I'm talking about timelines is you can also, when you're, let's go back over here, when you're saving this, you can save a snapshot. Let's just save a snapshot. I'll take a snapshot at the end of a team meeting, maybe a before and after. So this has been saved. But one of the things that you can do with a saved is that you can create a baseline snapshot. And a baseline snapshot, again, Sparx 17, be very, if you're in an earlier version, you don't have timelines yet. So upgrade and get timelines, very powerful. But anyways, you can save baselines of a snapshot. Very important when you're doing review meetings and the teams all agreed on a particular model or models and going, okay, I'm in a baseline. It's been approved. I'm going to create a snapshot picture of this in the timeline and then keep my baseline notes there as well. So again, back to naming conventions and making sure that you're populating your notes and your descriptions. Before we get into the demonstration, which is going to be the next episode in this 3-part series, I want to talk about educating stakeholders. So the project manager is going to publish a communication plan in the beginning and kickoff of the project. You're going to have half a dozen or even much more stakeholders involved in the project, and you are going to have to educate them. Going over the communication plan very quickly in a kickoff meeting is not ensuring the stakeholders are following the proper practices. So you're auditing your work. The project manager hopefully is supporting that auditing of work, running regular reports, have fallback plans and backups to ensure that if something does happen inadvertently by a stakeholder that has not been properly educated, that should trigger an education event stating that, all right, you're authorized to do this, but you're not following the practices and it's creating more work for us. So educate the stakeholders going beyond the communication plan and ensure that you're using the capabilities, the discussion capabilities within Sparx, as well as the journal capabilities to journalize risks, to journalize change, to discuss and journalize problems, right? And if someone's creating a problem, just make sure you're communicating with them and you are educating them. Through that education, you could be educating yourself that someone might come up with a better process for process improvement, for causal analysis. So educate stakeholders, very important topic, and I wanted to make sure I covered it. All right, we're going to wrap up now. Thanks very much for watching. Leave comments down below. Let any questions that you have come out, and I'll try to answer them as soon as possible. Today, we talked about change management, particularly around baselining. Every time you make a change, not every time, but most of the times when you're making critical changes, you're going to want to take a snapshot. We do that through baseline. If you're in Sparx 17 or above, you've got timelines. Showed you how to baseline your timelines as well. We talked about compare before you restore. Nothing's worse than stepping on your teammates' work or your own work. But remember, you can always fall back if you baseline before you did a restore. So you can move between your baselines in almost every case. There's some edge cases where as you get in older baselines, if you've done some things wrong, you can corrupt the file, and we've seen some issues there before. So we talked about version control systems when possible. Typically, we do this around development shops where there's code involved. We talked about coordinating with team-based modeling. So make sure that all of you within the team working on a project in Sparx understand what needs to be done and the practices to be followed, especially the naming conventions. We talked about automating when possible, whether you're automating your elements and the naming schemes or starting naming schemes and description direction. We talked about that in this session. Back up your repository regularly. And our focus here is on backing up your baselines. And then we talked about educating your stakeholders. Just because the stakeholder has gone through a communication plan, they understand how the projects were supposed to communicate. If they're not following the practices, then educate them before they make some serious mistakes or disrupt your effective delivery. So until that next episode where we're going to be demonstrating everything we talked about, happy modeling.